Welcome to another Path of Exile 2 mechanics video. In this series on the road to Path of Exile 2's early access launch on November 15th, I'm covering Path of Exile 2's mechanics, discussing how they work and how they differ from the same mechanics in Path of Exile 1 to create a resource that's useful for new players and veterans alike. You can check out the full series by following the link in the video description below. This video is all about critical strikes. Let's get into it. A critical strike in Path of Exile is a hit which succeeds a critical strike roll check and thus deals damage which is multiplied by a critical strike multiplier. But Path of Exile 2 is making some very big changes to critical strikes. Firstly, the term critical strike multiplier is going away completely in PoE 2, and a new term, critical damage bonus, will be used in its place. As a disclaimer here, Viperesque, a Path of Exile 2 developer, on the official Path of Exile Discord server, has stated that this new terminology is possibly subject to change before or during the early access period, as they're not entirely happy with any potential confusion that it could cause. But let's continue. So, what's the difference between critical strike multiplier in PoE 1 and critical damage bonus in PoE 2? Well, critical strike multiplier is the total multiplier for damage from a critical strike. By default, the base critical strike multiplier in PoE 1 is 150%, for a total of 50% extra critical damage from a critical strike. But in PoE 2, critical damage bonus only refers to the extra damage portion that a critical strike deals. By default, this will be 100%, for a total 200% damage multiplier from a critical strike, 100% from the base hit and 100% critical damage bonus. So, by default, not inclusive of any extra modifiers or scaling potential, the baseline critical strike damage in PoE 2 is being buffed from PoE 1. But importantly, the scaling of critical strikes and the damage they deal is changing massively between PoE 1 and PoE 2 as well. As I mentioned before, critical strike multiplier won't exist in PoE 2. Instead, two new stats will exist to scale the extra damage you deal from critical strikes. Firstly, the more common modifiers will be multipliers to critical damage bonus. These will mostly be comprised of increases or reductions to critical damage bonus, and rarely they'll exist as more or less multipliers to critical damage bonus. Secondly, less common modifiers will exist as additions to critical damage bonus. These will function exactly as critical strike multiplier does in PoE 1, adding their bonus directly to create a total critical damage bonus stat which is then scaled by any relevant multipliers. Let's take a look at some examples to tie this together. These gloves have a modifier which provides 22% increased critical damage bonus. Then we have this flail which has a modifier for plus 41% to critical damage bonus. Lastly, we have the Pain Attunement Keystone, which in PoE 2 grants 30% less critical damage bonus when on full life, and 30% more critical damage bonus when on low life. Let's say a character has the gloves and flail equipped and has the Pain Attunement Keystone allocated on the passive skill tree. The character is also on low life for the purposes of Pain Attunement. If the character has no other modifiers to critical damage bonus, they'd have the 100% default critical damage bonus, and this is where the additional critical damage bonus is applied from the flail, for a total 141% critical damage bonus. Then, this number is multiplied by the increase and the more multiplier, for a final total 223% critical damage bonus. This character's critical strikes would deal a total 323% of base damage. That's 100% from the base hit, and 223% critical damage bonus. Okay, so what about critical strike charms? Well, Path of Exile 2 is making changes to that as well, but this is going to be more in the form of stat allocation rather than modifier changes. In PoE 2, you'll generally have access to higher base critical chance weapons and spells. For example, this Crone Knife or this Icicle Flail. But there will still be plenty of low base critical strike chance weapons and spells as well. And this is because the base critical strike chance for weapons and spells are typically associated with their attribute alignment. Let's take a look at these comments from Viperesque, detailing the generalized order for spell-based crit based on damage type, and the idea that crits are intelligence aligned, so intelligence-based weapons tend to have higher base critical strike chance. We don't know how accessible increases or additions to critical strike chance will be in PoE 2, but it may be a bit less accessible numerically or a generally scarcer stat considering the magnitude of some of the critical strike chances on some weapons and spells. And this would result in it being significantly easier to cap critical strike chance on a cold spell, for example, compared to a melee mace build. Now, lastly for this video, there is one other very significant change to critical strikes going from PoE 1 to PoE 2, and this has to do with ailments. In PoE 1, a critical strike will guarantee the application of elemental ailments based on damage type. For example, a hit of fire damage, which is a critical strike, will apply Ignite based on the total fire damage of that hit. But in PoE 2, elemental ailments are no longer guaranteed by critical strikes. On Discord, Shax MC asked if critting guarantees ailments, and Viperesque replied that it does not. Critting increases the chance of igniting an enemy since that is based on the damage you deal, but does not guarantee it. Now, Viperesque is referencing another mechanical change in this response, which is to do with how ailment application in general will work in PoE 2. Which is now going to be based on the damage rather than a critical strike check or the chance to inflict an ailment. But we'll go into that one in detail in a future video. For this video, the important takeaway here is that critical strikes will no longer provide a guaranteed way to inflict elemental ailments.